All right, everybody. Hey, welcome to Mondays with Mike. Happy 4th of July. It's great to be back. I was out of town for a week. Maybe you noticed, maybe you didn't. Summertime, you might not be tuning in, but I was out of town for what's called, well, it was vacation, but at the beginning, before it actually became a vacation, I was at what's called the Fox Weather Summit. Now, if you're not familiar with Fox Weather, you can find it on any streaming platform. Like you can, if you have Roku or Xfinity or Apple TV, whatever you have, search for Fox Weather. It's a streaming weather network. It's a competitor to that other one called the Weather something. And anyway, it's a big production up there in New York City. So they invited a meteorologist and one of the news managers from every Fox-owned station in the station group. So to go to New York City and to meet with them. And we had 2 days of, I think, really sort of educational and positive discussions and meetings and things like that. So it was me and my boss, and there was Atlanta was there, and Milwaukee was there, and Chicago, and New York, and San Francisco, Seattle, Tampa, Orlando. So a bunch of people were all there. And, you get to kind of learn, I guess, what you call it in business terms, best practices. What's the best way to do this, the best way to do that. And I actually wanted to sort of share a little bit with you about what some of the folks had to say. And I'll tell you about my vacation too, if you want. I'm going to show you all the pictures of my vacation. No, I'm not. But so we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that came up. And then I want to talk about Hurricane Bonnie, which is one of these rare, not unheard of, but only happens maybe once every 10 years, storms that kept its name as it moved across the continent, basically, as it moved across Costa Rica from the Atlantic Basin to the Pacific Basin. And it is still really roaring out there south of Mexico. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let me go ahead and do this. I'm going to click on this and hit share. And that's not what I wanted to share with you. That's not at all what I wanted to share with you. There we go. That's what I wanted to share with you. All right. So let's see. Okay, so one of the things that came up was this. Let me zoom in on this. So Brian Norcross, who is a tropical weather expert now for Fox Weather, and previous to that, he was with the Weather Channel and he was with CBS, and he was one of my mentors, weather icons, whatever you want to call it. He did a talk, and one of the things that he talked about was simplifying the message. And this is going to be something that I want some feedback from you on. Simplifying the message. There's a lot of jargon and terminology that goes along with all types of weather. In particular, I want to talk about hurricane season. And one of them popped up last week, okay? And it was this very strangely, and I think maybe not so well named system called potential tropical cyclone number 2. Now, you may remember potential tropical cyclone number 1. That was right at the beginning of June, end of May. It was right at the end of May. And it brought some heavy rain to Florida. We had a storm named Agatha that was a hurricane, and it hit Mexico, and it kind of fell apart. And then some of the remnants of it reemerged over the southern Gulf of Mexico and the Western Caribbean. Anyway, it was given this name, this distinction by the National Hurricane Center, potential tropical cyclone number 1. What in the world is that? Well, we tried to explain on the air. Basically, it just means that the National Hurricane Center can now provide us a cone of uncertainty and provide us with a forecast on this system that is very likely or is about to become tropical depression number 1 or tropical storm Alex. Well, as it turned out, strangely enough, it was not upgraded before it hit Florida. So it brought a foot of rain to Miami. it was still potential tropical cyclone number 1. And then eventually it became Alex. So anyway, last week we had potential tropical cyclone number 2. Now, I don't think we're going to see a ton of these, but it does happen. And the purpose of it, as clumsily as it's named, the purpose of it is that it allows the National Hurricane Center to give a forecast on a storm that hasn't been named yet. So anyway, that's one of the terms that comes up. And so what Brian Norcross was saying was, it's much less tedious. It's much easier to just call it a tropical disturbance, to just say something like, this is a tropical disturbance and it's probably going to get a name here pretty soon. And this is the forecast from the National Hurricane Center. It might be easier, and maybe less clumsy to say tropical disturbance or just disturbance instead of potential tropical cyclone number 2. So I don't know. Let me know what you think about that. I mean, I'd love to hear from you, via here, social media, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, or, just shout at me at the grocery store. I'm curious about that. Do we sometimes use these terms that are ugly to say? I mean, it's really not a very, doesn't roll off the tongue. Potential tropical cyclone. Anyway, became Bonnie, and we're going to look at this in a minute. It became Bonnie, moved across Central America, and now is a hurricane in the Pacific, one of these rare things that survived its trip across the continent. The other thing that came up, and I've been saying this for years, and nobody listened to me. Nobody cares when I said it, but if somebody important says it, then it carries some water. And that is this whole idea, and you'll see it here in the middle of your screen. I'm just going to zoom in on it. The classification of storms. Okay, so we have a tropical depression, which will get a number, and then you'll have a tropical storm, which will get a name, and then you'll have a hurricane, which of course will keep that name, and then a major hurricane. And people will always put these wind speed ranges, right? So it will say tropical storm is when the storm reaches 39 mile per hour winds, and it's between 39 and 73 miles per hour. Well, we know that's bogus, right? There's never been a 39 mile per hour tropical storm ever. Why? Because the numbers are rounded to the nearest 5, okay? There's never going to be a 39 mile per hour tropical storm. There's never going to be a 74 mile per hour hurricane. It's rounded to 5. And so we could just keep it very basic and much easier to understand by saying that if the maximum winds found in what we would call a tropical cyclone or a tropical storm are between 40 and 70 miles per hour, then it's a tropical storm, 40 to 70. And then a hurricane is 75 or higher, right? It's much easier to look at it that way because there's not going to be an in-between. If it's 72, it'll get rounded down to 70. And if it's 73 or 4, it gets rounded up to 75. So that's that. So you're probably going to hear me or see me describing it that way. So that's that. And as far as, some of the other things that come up, the cone of uncertainty, one of the things that came up is the cone is king. That was one of the phrases, that we took away from the conference is the cone is king. Cone is king. So everybody wants to see the cone, right? Well, did you know this cone of uncertainty that's put together by the National Hurricane Center is based on historical errors? In other words, on average, how good has their forecast been over the last 5, I think it's 5 years, over the last 5 years. And so what's happened is what you can imagine is that as technology gets better and better, as computer models get better, as our observations get better, everything's getting better. The forecast is also getting better, much, much better. And so that cone of uncertainty used to be really big, and now we're shrinking it smaller and smaller and smaller, which is good in many ways, but it does present a challenge. Well, why wouldn't we want to have the best forecast possible? Of course we do. But when you're looking at this cone that's on your screen right now, it's very, very important to realize that that H that you see there in that cone is the forecast of the center of a storm, the center of this hurricane. What this doesn't tell you is how big the hurricane is going to be. So what happens is that when we used to have a big fat cone, okay, if the hurricane was very large, it would end up in that cone. The cone almost gave you an idea of the fact that hurricanes are big. Now with the cone getting smaller and smaller, the extent of the hurricane, the effects of the hurricane are now going to be felt outside of that cone. You see what I mean? The cone is getting smaller, the hurricane is not getting smaller. And so as a result, that's something to pay attention to, because eventually as we get really good at forecasting, that cone's going to shrink more and more, which will make the presenting it on the air a little bit harder. The wind field here that I'm toggling off and on shows you how far out those tropical storm force winds go, for example, and down here at the beginning of the cone. And you'll see there that the yellow area, which represents the extent of the tropical storm winds, is well outside of the cone. It's not that the cone is wrong, it's that the cone is tracking the center of the storm, and those winds can extend out far beyond that. So that's definitely something that you'll be hearing. So that's a couple of the big takeaways that I took from Brian's talk. Another one, though, is that I want to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to computer models, spaghetti models. All right. Oh, the spaghetti model. Okay, so let's go ahead. I'm going to pull this up. So what you're looking at right now is this Hurricane Bonnie. Okay, these are our major computer models forecasting the center of Bonnie. Now, a lot of the names that you're seeing on here, well, it's all garbled together. I know you can't see, but included in this list are things like the GFS computer model, which strangely enough, maybe confusingly enough, is labeled as AVNO because the GFS used to be called the aviation model. But the AVNO is what we call the operational GFS model. You're going to have the UK model in there, the UK Met. We also have various what are called consensus models in there that take a percentage or a weighted average of a lot of the different models they have. But in this case, they're all basically pointed at the same spot, which is good. You know, that definitely makes things easier. It is much more difficult if they are not in agreement. Oh, there's a satellite loop of Bonnie, so you can see that. But I wanted to show you one that was not in such good agreement. Okay, so what you're looking at right now is what's called an ensemble forecast. And this is one of those things that you may see me show during this hurricane season. Well, what is it? What is it? Well, this is the GFS computer model. That's the American computer model, the global forecast system. Well, what are all these other squiggly lines all over the place? Well, you're going to get several different, I think it's 20, different ensemble members. So basically what you do is you have what's called an operational model, where you take the initial conditions here and you want to predict where this cloud is going to be here, and it tracks it exactly. The farther out that you go, the more error there's going to be. And for that, I want to show you this. Okay. This is called the double pendulum. Why on earth do I want to show you the double pendulum? Why on earth is it not animating? Come on. It was just animating like 10 seconds ago. There it is. So why am I showing you the pendulum swinging around? Because this is an example of chaotic motion. What it means is that here at the beginning of the loop, you're going to notice they're pretty close together. They're almost doing the same thing. But if we keep watching and just wait a few more seconds, what you'll find is that these pendulums that are going back and forth start to be completely different. Now they're not even doing anything remotely similar to each other. This is why computer models can't be accurate, 100% accurate, as you get 10 days out, 12 days out, and they go to 16 days. By the end of 16 days, this is what you get, this chaos, okay? So that's why using what's called an operational or a deterministic model you can't trust. In other words, if somebody shows you, and people have been doing this already this year, if somebody shows you a forecast that's 15 days out and says, oh my gosh, look at this hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, it's completely bogus, because that is just like, it would be the same thing as if you picked one of these pendulums and said, oh, that's where the black dot is going to be 15 minutes from now. It is impossible to predict. In fact, the term that was used, but Brian used it, and I think I've probably said it before too. It's unforecastable is what it's called. You cannot pinpoint something that far out. What you can do though is you can take an average of lots of different models, and then you're going to find a good result. And so that's kind of what this is doing. So this is called the GFS ensemble. And what you do is you take a model, like you take the GFS model, and you want to track a storm or anything, could be a winter storm. And then you run that model 20 different times. And each time you run it, you make tiny changes. Because think about it, like if you had to measure, oh gosh, I weighed myself this morning and I didn't really like what the scale said, but let's just say that the scale said like 179.2. Well, was it really 179.2, or could it have been 179.15? Could it have been 172.253? Yeah, there's going to be rounding, right? Well, all of those errors go into computer models too. Maybe the temperature wasn't 75, maybe it was 74.8. So what an ensemble does is it takes all those little variables and just it changes them in a tiny way. Just like those pendulums, if you were to just change it a tiny way when you started it. And so what you end up with is what you see right here on your screen, which is a spaghetti model plot, all of the same model. This is all the GFS model. And each one of these lines represents a different member of the ensemble, a different run of the model, with small changes made to the initial conditions. So what ends up happening is you sort of take an average of all of those and you get what's called the ensemble forecast. And you know what? The ensemble tends to be very reliable. So the ensemble is your best bet. And it also is along the same lines as what we would call the consensus. And so that's what you're seeing here. Like when you see this, there's a red one, it's all kind of buried in there, but OFCL is going to be the official. And then a lot of these other ones are going to be different types of consensus models. But bottom line is, don't look at any one model. And if somebody on TV is showing you some spaghetti plot and the lines are going all over the place and all that stuff, then or even if I do that, I probably shouldn't be doing that. And if I've done it before, you know, I've had a chance to reassess and say, we're only going to show you the models that make sense. And if there's an outlier model that's doing something wacky, we're going to explain why it's doing that. And maybe even like gray it out, or because these plots have to be useful. I don't want to just show them just to show them. And that's the thing. It's like, well, the other station's showing it, so you have to show it. Well, yes, but you have to do it with a purpose, right? Enough of that. I wanted to quickly move on here and just show you Bonnie. This is occasionally, you probably know this, okay? Occasionally, we get storms that are in the Pacific Ocean and they hit Mexico, and then some of the cloud cover moves across into the Gulf of Mexico and sometimes can form into a new storm. And that happens pretty commonly. You know, maybe it happens every year, maybe it happens every other year. So we've definitely had that happen before, and it happened this year, just like I mentioned at the beginning of the talk here, with potential tropical cyclone number 1. It was Hurricane Agatha. Well, Bonnie managed to hit Costa Rica as a tropical storm. Bonnie maintained its tropical storm status as it moved across Costa Rica because it's thin, okay? It's a relatively thin part of Central America. And as it emerged back over the Pacific Ocean, it was still Tropical Storm Bonnie, and as a result, still maintained its designation as Bonnie. And so it is now Hurricane Bonnie. So that's what's going on with that. And the last time that happened, 2016, with a storm named Otto. You could look it up, Hurricane Otto. It hit almost the exact same location. And it's not Otto like the auto show. It's Otto like autogram, O-T-T-O. So very interesting stuff, I think. Let's see, the last thing that I wanted to talk to you about, let's see, told you about Hurricane Bonnie, told you about fox weather in New York briefly, which I did see my buddy Stephen Morgan, and Britta Merwin was up there also. Talked about the spaghetti models, talked about hurricanes and spaghetti plots. Okay, so I think I've accomplished most of what I wanted to tell you this week. So I was off for a week. I'm getting back in the swing of things today. I'm sluggish, just sluggish. So bear with me if I kind of like stumbled over my words a couple times this morning, as any human would do, right? And so yeah, I mean, there's only so much coffee somebody could drink, but I'm getting back into it. The good thing is, well, or the bad thing is that the weather looks fine for the 4th of July. It's going to be hot and humid. Probably, I don't anticipate any rain. Doesn't look like there's going to be any rain around. I mean, if there were any rain, it would be really short-lived and small. And then it's going to be that way the rest of the week. A few isolated storms, otherwise super duper hot. We are back in heat wave mode. We're going to be running above average every day for at least the next 7 days, if not longer. Hooray. So anyway, hey, thanks for joining us for Mondays with Mike today. I will see you next week. I want to try to answer some of your questions as well. If you have anything you would like to ask, you could write it to me on my Facebook page or on, let's see, Twitter, YouTube, email, any sort of electronic means. And I'd be happy to get to it because I know a lot of you have questions. It's fun to answer them. And I can ask you about your job too, because I'm always fascinated what other people do. I really am. Anyway, that'll do it. Hey, have a great 4th of July. Hope you had a great weekend. Looking forward to a nice hot week. And that's it. See you later.